so intriguing to me that whenever I look at the marriage assessment that we have at ChangeTheOdds.com, a marriage assessment that we started here at the church, taking friends, partners, and lovers, giving 10 questions on friendship, 10 on partnership, 10 on what it means to be a lover, that by and large, the lowest score is almost always the score of intimacy. And so why is that? What's going on? Is it just simply, and this would make total sense, that they build on each other, that a good friendship and a good partnership are now prerequisites to a truly happy and satisfying life of intimacy? It's very possible that that is what is taking place. Or is there something else that's going on? I'm not real sure, other than just to say the facts, that in our church specifically, and then I've taken this nationally as well, in several thousand people who have taken this assessment, the lover score is always the lowest for the group, not maybe for individuals. And so what is it that's going on there? And so we're just going to ask a couple of questions here and kind of work through some issues. So why is sex such a source of frustration for so many couples? So it's not like I ever sit down with a young couple who they're going to get married, and let's say they're in their early 20s. They're never sitting on my couch thinking to themselves, ooh, you know what's going to be the cause of the most fights in our relationship? The sex. They never think that. They think just naturally the intimacy thing we've already figured out. And even if they're going with strong boundaries, they just assume that once the marriage comes and those boundaries can broaden, and to some extent that everything's going to be great. And yet that's not the experience for so many people. Why is that? Well, first, consider the garden. Consider our history, our human history, the way the Bible explains it. I would actually say that if intimacy is a common point of contention within your relationship, that is to some extent a testimony of the truth of the Bible, of the origins of humanity. Apart from the idea that we were created by God, we have fallen, we have sinned, we now live in this broken world. Jesus has come to redeem it, and one day he's going to make all things right. Outside of that framework, into any other worldview, the idea that intimacy is difficult, I don't feel like you take two dogs that they're having a great fight over sex. So why is it that we do? It's because it means so much more, and the Christian story explains it to us. That when sin entered the world, the very first response of Adam and Eve was to hide and to cover themselves, which begins to show how our sexual nature goes to the very core of who we are as individuals, and that sin, maybe one of the very first things it touches, is our own sexuality. And so this should give us an extreme amount of compassion and empathy and understanding for ourselves, for our spouse, for this fallen and broken world, specifically those who know nothing of Jesus. We should never expect them to act in holy ways when it comes to sexuality. We should never expect them to have this extreme clarity on these sexual issues when we understand that sin has in so many ways shattered our understanding of ourselves and our intimacy with God and our intimacy with each other. And so few things touch our sense of identity as much as sex. I still remember sitting in Hebrew class, and I didn't understand a lot in Hebrew class. But Dr. Ken Matthews, just one of the great scholars of all time, actually worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I remember him walking us through Genesis 2 and 3 and just pausing one day and saying, one of the greatest cut downs you can ever make to a person, male or female, is to question their sexual identity. He said, don't joke about it. Don't call a boy a girl. Don't call a girl a boy. And how interesting is it now, all these decades later, to see what's going on in our culture and to understand the danger of all those things. So it cuts to the very core of who we are. And then there's a stark contrast between what the media portrays and the truth, even oftentimes what the church portrays. Here's the message I received growing up. Now, I'm not saying it's the message that was being taught, but it was the message as I received it. So I grew up, right, a boy in the 90s, Southern Baptist Church in the 90s, right? So in that day, there were two major teachings. One was that true love waits, a good understanding of abstinence until marriage, right? The other one was pack your bags, Jesus is coming, before 1999. Those were the two main teachings, right? So basically they were telling us, wait till marriage, but the Lord's going to return before you ever get married, so good luck. But here's the basic concept. If you will save yourself for marriage and date right, you will have this unbelievable marriage. And here's what was incomplete about that message. It was like we were making a deal with God. All right, if I don't sin in that way, you're guaranteeing me this marriage with ease, which isn't true for anybody at any time. And so many of us who grew up in that way then got married, and then sex is radically different than even the way that the church portrayed it. Not even to talk about the media. And thankfully, I grew up in a day really before so much of the pornography and the access to it. But what we see, I mean, we would be hard-pressed to name a movie that portrays sex in a true way. That would say, hey, here's what it actually looks like. Instead, we're given this picture of sex that doesn't match reality. Let me give you just one example. 60% of women cannot reach orgasm by simple penile insertion alone. 60% can't. Not possible. It takes other means for them to climax. When was the last time you saw a movie that illustrated that? Now, let's be careful about the illustration of that. But even the implication. So think about what's happening, and pornography is an issue for men and women of all ages now. But imagine our children now being exposed, now let's say just to pornography alone, and the pornography being portrayed in no way matches what brings pleasure to a woman. Causing now a woman, as a girl grows up into a woman, if she's seen any of this, she's going to think, what's wrong with me if that doesn't bring me pleasure? And then a guy is going to think either what's wrong with her, that this doesn't bring her pleasure, or why can't I do it in the right way? And so either way, they're going to walk into a relationship with these expectations that in no way match the truth of what they're going to experience, which by nature is going to cause them to question themselves and each other and even the institution of marriage. Is it any wonder that this is a point of contention? So if nothing else here, I think, it just in this session alone, whenever it comes to the skill of intimacy, of being a lover, maybe one of the things that we just have to understand is, look, this is going to be a point that we're going to have to learn. It doesn't come naturally. We feel like it's just going to come naturally. We're set up for that as the hormones begin to take place. We don't have to be trained of how to have attraction towards somebody else. That doesn't have to be trained within us. We do have to be trained about how to bring pleasure to them and how to communicate them to bring pleasure to us. That's a skill to be learned, and it's meant to be learned in marriage. This is the beauty of God's design. That the skill that there's no way you can know on your own is going to now demand a time and understanding and communication and intimacy and failure and trust and respect and vulnerability. And so you don't want to just go out there and try this with anybody. Instead, you want to make sure that you have somebody who's going to treat your heart right, who is for you, who loves you, who now you can let the guard down with them. And as the two of you learn over time to bring pleasure to one another, it becomes this great strength in your relationship that you, in a way that you have with nobody else. And this is the beauty of God's design. Just imagine this. How many societal ills would immediately go away if sex only took place in a loving, committed relationship between a husband and wife? And yet we question God. You show me a better plan. There's not one. And yet that's not the way it's portrayed anyway. As a matter of fact, I would say generally speaking, whenever it comes to movies, television shows, The message that we get sent is that married sex is boring and illicit sex elsewhere is exciting. And yet you look at any of the statistics run by psychologists or sociologists, and they will say your greatest chance at sexual satisfaction is within a committed, loving relationship. Now, that doesn't guarantee that if you get married, you're going to have a great sex life. It doesn't guarantee that. It just makes it more likely to happen. Then you got to get to work and make it happen. So we also struggle to have productive conversations about it. So I don't think it's any accident that as you look at the surveys, and I didn't review it tonight, I probably should have, but generally speaking, as you look at the 10 questions on intimacy on the Friends, Partners, and Lovers assessment, if you haven't taken it, you can go to changetheodds.com and take it. I'll try to include it in the email this coming week. But if you look within that, there are a couple questions that I think coincide. One question basically is, how satisfied are you sexually? And that's a little bit lower than what we want it to be. And then another question is, how openly and honestly can you talk to your partner about what brings you pleasure, about what turns you off, what turns you on, and those kind of things. And those two questions are parallel. To the extent that you and your partner can have a productive conversation about sexual things is almost the guarantee of what your sexual satisfaction will be like. And yet, for various reasons, we can't. Sometimes it's because of our own pain, our own trauma from our past. Sometimes it's because we grew up in a way that was very sheltered, and we were kind of given the message, whether we wanted to receive it that way or not, or it was even intentionally taught that way or not, that these are dirty topics. You don't discuss them in any way. Or maybe there is a lack of trust or respect within the relationship, past hurts that were there, affairs that have taken place, addictions, pornographies, those kind of things, in which we just don't feel the ability to actually have these conversations. Whatever it actually is, if you and I can't have the conversation, the chance of satisfaction is probably pretty slim. So we actually have to back out and begin to look at what is it that allows us to have the conversation. So notice how we now have what we talked about in the first session, skill stacking. Remember skill stacking? You learn one skill, and that empowers you to learn something else, which empowers you to learn something else. If you and I learn emotional regulation, that will empower us to have better conversations. Better conversations will empower us now to problem solve in a more productive way. Better problem solving and better conversations now empowers us to have sexual conversations, which means we end up with a better sex life. Sometimes if you want a better sex life, you need to learn to emotionally regulate yourself. And then it's just a process that begins. That's the beauty, the potential, what goes on in marriage. So it's interesting, Gottman here narrows it down in a way that I've never thought about, but John Gottman is kind of the leading expert these days outside of Christian thought of what makes good sex. And he says it comes down to two simple things. It's good friends who prioritize sex. And for him, that's it. Good friends who prioritize sex. Now, I say on here, remember the 70%. If you remember, they surveyed several thousand women, and they said, hey, of these 5 to 10 qualities, what's the most important whenever it comes to sex? And 70% of women said that friendship was the most important thing that led to good sex. So then they surveyed several thousand men, and if you remember, it was 70% who said friendship. So men and women are not in disagreement here. Men and women often see this issue in different ways. I get it. But whenever it comes to what defines good sex, men and women both believe and understand that a strong friendship now leads to better intimacy. So for many of us, that's where we want to start. We want to begin to figure out, how can we build our friendship? How can we encourage our friendship? And so within this, you have issues of trust, of play, of being able to have fun with one another, of knowing your spouse is for you and that they love you. You're walking side by side through life. You feel this deep emotional connection. If you have that, if you have this strong emotional connection, now all you have to really do is prioritize this within your life and say, all right, this is important. Now notice, this is what we say in Friends, Partners, and Lovers. It's not the most important thing. The book is not lovers, lovers, and lovers. But it's not the least important thing, or it's not even a secondary thing. Friends, partners, and lovers, it's like 3 legs of a stool where they are all equally important. None of them above the other. They're all equally important. And when one suffers, the other suffers. And so if you already have a deep emotional connection, not perfection, but a deep emotional connection with one another, you love your spouse, they love you, you trust each other. Now, how can you prioritize this in your life? And what does that even look like? What does it mean to prioritize? Well, first, it means time. It means we're going to set apart time to say this is important. Secondly, it's the concept of learning. If this is important to us, we need to figure out how to do it. And yes, practice helps, but it might also mean research in healthy ways, good Christian resources now that you can read. Don't just go search on the internet how to have great sex, filters off. Don't do that. But we have some good resources that we can begin to point you to begin to figure this out. And so to prioritize it means we're going to recognize this is an important aspect of life. There's going to be seasons of ebb and flow, no doubt. It's going to look different. It's going to look different if you're married at 23 than it is whenever you're married at 73 than it is whenever you're married at 43 and kids run around, all this. It's going to look different in every season. But what does intimacy look like in this season for us, and how can we prioritize it? Gottman is saying if you're good, if you have the attachment and you make it a priority, everything else will take care of itself. Now, are there exceptions to that? Maybe there are. But for the majority of us, that's where we can come back to. So I love this question. Why is cuddling such a good indicator of sexual satisfaction? So Gottman here is going to say this as well. He's going to say if you want to look at something that is correlated with healthy sexuality, show me a couple who regularly cuddles, and I will show you a couple who in all likelihood has a high level of sexual satisfaction. Why is that? Well, okay, if you're willing to cuddle together, that means there's a sense of safety. You don't cuddle with somebody who's a danger to you. It's something you can actually watch for in the relationship. If your body tenses when your spouse hugs you, that's the question you need to be asking with a professional. It may not be them. It could be some past trauma that you're having to deal with. But it should always be a sense of relaxation with your spouse, not a tension. And so if you have that safety with a person, you can let your guard down. And in part, that safety is there because you trust them. Because you know in that moment that they're not going to abuse you or misuse you. We can look at this as far as actual physical or emotional abuse. You're not going to cuddle with somebody who's verbally abusive, physically abusive. You're also not going to just relax if you're afraid at any moment they could jokingly just startle you. That's not going to cause you to relax. But there's a trust. I'm safe here. I know how they're going to treat me, and they're going to treat me right. And then there is just this idea of rest. That our hearts begin to get in sync whenever we're touching in that way. Oxytocin is released within the body, which is that feel-good kind of feeling that you can get from your spouse. I mean, you can also get it from petting a dog, but that's a whole different story. Your cortisol begins to diminish. The stress hormone goes down, and you relax. And I don't think we can downplay this. That for the average woman, 1 hour of extra sleep at night is probably more effective than anything else whenever it comes to increasing sexual satisfaction. The importance of rest. Now, it could be in how God designed us. It could be different personalities. I don't know. I know in a lot of scenarios, the guy needs sex to sleep, and the woman needs sleep to have sex. So you got to figure that out. But over the average week, to allow her to experience more sleep, in all likelihood, raises the satisfaction of sex. And so women often say that sex would be better if their husbands were better partners. So friendship is important, no doubt. But there's also a sense of partnership. There's also this sense of it's hard for her to relax in bed if she's still thinking about how dirty the kitchen is. I remember years ago, you've heard me tell, I'm to a point now where you've heard every story, But unlike my coworkers, I like to tell you when I'm about to tell a story that I've already told, just to let you know that I'm aware I've already told this story. So early on in marriage, right, Jenny and I are having a discussion, and I said, man, jokingly, with truth, I said, man, I wish we had it, guys had it as easy as women have it. And she's like, oh yeah, do tell. And I said, everything is complicated, I get, but generally speaking, right, as a 27-year-old guy at the time, you kind of know what I want to be happy and satisfied. Like sex, like that's it. Like that's the primary thing. And I just wish it was that clear of what I could bring you to make you feel in an equal way. And she goes, there is. I said, what do you mean there is? She goes, oh, there's one thing. I said, well, what is it? She goes, clean the kitchen. Because what she was saying in that moment is when you clean the kitchen, what you're saying is that's not all on me. We're in this together. And I feel seen and valued, and I feel like there's what she was saying is, hey, you want me to be a better lover, be a better partner. They all play in with one another. So what are some practical tips now to improve sex? One is don't make it the last thing to do on the to-do list. Now this depends on your stage of life, where you are. So remember, a lot of my teaching on this topic is going to come from a lot of my writing on this topic is going to come from when my kids were in elementary school. My speaking on this topic is going to come from the time when my kids were in junior high and high school, which they love that being on YouTube. But what happens is you get so busy that, and when does sex happen for most couples? For most couples, sex happens at night. And so what that means is you're living your whole day, and at the very end, you're collapsing into bed at the end of work and parenting and carting kids left and right and taking care of the house and all the demands. And at the very end, you're collapsing in the bed to see if you have any energy left over for your spouse. And what I often tell young couples, if at all possible, have as much sex as possible in the daylight. It will just be more meaningful. Now, I get that it's difficult. I get that. But if your spouse is just continually getting the leftovers of you, they will often have emotionally left before the relationship is over. There has to be this prioritization of each other. Now, I recognize there are seasons in life in which this is just going to be far more difficult. It's why, if at all possible, to recruit the grandparents. If they're not around, find grandparents around here. They can be around. They can watch your kids. And you can have a date night. And man, take them, drop them off, go home, have sex, then go out for dinner. That way there's no risk of what you can eat whatever you want to then. Who cares what you eat? Here, honey, have more. I don't care. Right? But don't risk the possibility of that being messed up in some way. But if you can now prioritize this at all possible, but the last thing is a dangerous thing. Increase all other forms of touch and intimacy. If you can increase your amount of touch outside the bedroom, it will naturally increase your amount of touch inside the bedroom. And just be aware, this isn't just sexual touch. This is the concept. Don't waste the opportunities. If you haven't seen each other all day long, now if you've been with each other all day, sit at different tables for all I care. You probably need some time apart. But if you haven't seen each other for all day long, how much have you touched tonight? Just sitting next to each other. It's an opportunity. Draw a line, but like a hand on the leg to hold hands, an arm around. First thing, I was sitting right down here when Jenny walked up. First thing I did was put my arm around her. It just needs to be a natural thing. That how can we now increase this amount of connection? If you do have small kids, hold your spouse's hand. It's a great thing for them to see. Make them jealous. Ella is still of an age. She might be in here. Actually, it's late. I don't care. She's going to college. Let's deal with this. All right. So Ella still can't stand for Jenny and I to show affection for each other. You know what I think? I don't care. I don't care. I'm still going to show affection, and she's going to hide her eyes. She's going to try to break us apart. Break us apart. It ain't working. She and I are together. Your kids need to see that. You know what? Your grandkids need to see that. They need to see this connection. Now, absolutely draw boundaries, put locks on doors, don't let them walk in on you, all those kind of things, absolutely. But to sit in church, what would be better? What if at your funeral, what your child or grandchild said, you know what I remember? You know the picture I'll forever have of mom and dad, of grandma and grandpa? Sitting in church with him having his arm around her. Does it get better than that? Why not increase all those opportunities? And then finally, how this has become the phrase I'm famous for in America, I have no idea. But this is it. Sex that's good for her is rarely bad for him. Sex that's good for him may or may not be good for her. But sex that's good for her is rarely bad for him. And so what we're saying in that moment is, to the extent that you prioritize the pleasure of each other, and we can even go further than that, I think. I think generally speaking, the guy's going to get pleasure, generally speaking, no matter what. If you will prioritize her pleasure, everybody will be happy. And yet what happens when intimacy goes wrong in a marriage, generally speaking, is sex solely becomes either about his release or his refusal. It's actually, this is an interesting concept here. Whenever you think about a lack of sexual satisfaction, our mind tends to immediately go to a man. Statistically speaking, it is far more likely that whenever you're talking about sexual dissatisfaction, the person on the other end of that is actually a woman. It is either a husband who doesn't know how to bring pleasure and has never prioritized it and is just like, figure it out yourself, or is living in refusal. Maybe there's an addiction, maybe there's other things. It is actually far more rare for the wife to regularly refuse sex than for the husband not to provide pleasure for the wife. Now, those are generic comments. Your situation could be different, no question. But if you as a couple will prioritize her satisfaction, generally speaking, everything else will take care of itself. I love Gottman's advice. Good friends who prioritize sex.